Welcome back. We're going to pick it up on number 16, which is what we call hands-on management, and we're working on class number 3, the lack of written procedure and breaking through it. Remember, what we're looking at right now is what does that lack of written procedure look like out there in the workforce. So if you look at hands-on management, this is one of those things that we were talking about of how with hands-on management, when there's no written procedure, how in the world can you delegate down? Because the last of the time that we tried to delegate down, we ended up getting burned. So ends up as we end up holding the deal close to us. And there's some other issues with that. We'll talk in other workshops about the power and the control and the fear and how that impacts. But if you look at on the hands-on management, is that when there's no written procedure, we end up having to really kind of do everything ourselves. And remember, if you're in an entrepreneurial company where they have started the company from scratch, it's sometimes very hard for that owner to start delegating because they've always kind of done it, they've always kind of done everything, but to start delegating because, again, the last time they delegated down, something usually went wrong. And when you have no written procedure, you're not going to delegate and you're going to become hands-on management. And that was one of the interesting things that we were talking about earlier, and you can see how we keep going back to being able to let go and delegate down to our base work centers. That's why we have to have those base skills throughout the organization. No delegating. It's really kind of interesting, the hands-on management, and that's kind of goes hand in hand there. We're looking at that you can't delegate. With no written procedure, there's absolutely no way to delegate successfully. Long term, you might be able to do some things, and you're going, hey, well, I'm a manager, I'm a co-worker, we're not saying that extreme that nothing gets done, but a lot of the stuff is that if we had written procedure, we could delegate it down. So if you look at an outdated procedure, if most organizations do have written procedure, they're usually outdated. Now, why are the procedures outdated? If you look at what happens is that I went into one company and we had a big plant and we had a bunch of written procedures up out there. And I go, well, how do the employees get training on that? Or how do they know that procedure? And he goes, oh, well, they know. I go, okay, well, when's the last time that thing been updated? They go, oh, well, they update it. I go, how and when and where? And so what we realized was that they had some procedure, but they were on the shelf doing what we call dust collecting manuals. And so if you look at it, most procedures that we have are outdated. How and why? Usually we dump it on a manager to go in and define your base, they don't call it base work centers, but define your organization, get them to define their jobs. Well, they're also trying to do their jobs. And so if you look at it, if we do even get some halfway job description written down, is that usually it's outdated and it's never updated again. And if you look at, we're saying the outdated procedure, it's interesting on that job description. That's why we call it a base work center. As we mentioned earlier in another class, reason we didn't call it a job description because the job description is very generic. If you do have a job description, look on it. It's usually 2 pages and it's like 24, 27 lines, and it has usually at the bottom, line 24, it says, and all other duties assigned. And we go, well, it doesn't tell you how to do the job. It gives you a lot of, but it's a good start. So you can take this and start building those base work centers. It's at least a good start. So if you look at it, the base work center, the written procedures actually telling you how to do the job. Okay, the technical procedure, this is really kind of interesting. We get a lot of organizations, whether it's computer software or out in the plant or whatever, that the procedures for operation or how to run that particular software is written by the techs that are doing it. Well, believe me, those guys are writing in a whole nother different language, and they haven't broken it down by the base work center. I say our typical, there's a story in the book that we call Don't Buy Until You Identify, is that most of the software training out there is that they all throw us into one big room, they go over the history of the software and everything that it'll do, and then all of a sudden I'm sitting here going, man, all I want to do is learn, do my job. I'm just accounts receivable. I just want to know that. But if you look at the training is not broken down by base work center. So the technical procedure comes down the pike, and by the time it gets on the floor, it just doesn't work. Or it's not in a terminology that we can understand or that we use. So if we do have procedure, it's stuffed in a book up on a shelf somewhere and we know nothing about it, and if we have used it or tried to use it, it's in technical terms that our people can't understand. So it says, how can we manage, plan, schedule, and monitor? If you look at number 20, you've heard this a gazillion times already, is that how in the world can we manage, plan, schedule, and monitor if we have no written procedure? There's absolutely no way to do this. So if you're trying to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor with no written procedure, believe me, you're just beating your head against a wall. And again, is it important for everybody in the organization to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor their base work center that's connected to other processes that make up the systems internally within the organization? Yes, it is. That again is why we have to have those base skills there. And without written procedure, there's absolutely no way for us to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the organization. We're haphazardly doing it right now. Some days we hit it, some days we don't. If you look at the inconsistency of product and or service, that's kind of been the theme throughout this thing of the stuff that aggravates our customers. If you look at it, the inconsistency, sometimes we deliver a great product, a great service, and everything's running good, and then all of a sudden it just goes in the toilet. And if you look at the inconsistency of our product and service, is that without written procedure, I don't know how in the world you could ever even think of getting it consistent. So if you look at without written procedure, you have inconsistent product and service. It's what we're doing internally within the organization. That's what's affecting our customers. Look at all the stuff that's going on out there in business now. Even if we do get it, a lot of times we can't retain the business. And we're so busy going out into the marketing side of it, getting out there and promoting it, that when the business starts coming in, we can't service it. And there's nothing worse than that. I think that's like marketing 101 or something. If you look at next category, so what we've talked about here is the product of lack of written procedure, what that lack of written procedure looks like. So when again, we want you to come out of this with the awareness and the understanding of why these things are happening. And being able to have this awareness means that you'll be able to not only keep it from happening, but you'll also have a corrective and preventive action for it, which we'll get into in later classes. Okay, let's look at how do we address the lack of written procedure. And what's interesting, it says remove the fear of expression or action. We've talked about it, we'll continually talk about it, and that's why fear is the number one, and we're saying we have to work on the fear. That's going to open up the communication. That's going to allow us to write the written procedure. So if you look at, this is what we're saying, all of these barriers here are twined together, is that you can't work on one without working on the other ones. It's like, you know, I was telling you, I go to one company and they go, hey, all we need is 2 of those barriers. And I go, by any chance? I said, is it written procedure and training? He goes, oh yeah. And he goes, don't you think? And he turns and looks at the guy, and the guy just goes, and I'm going, oh yeah, you have no fear. Okay, let's look at have open and honest communication. In order to address that written procedure, we have to remove the fear, and we have to have open and honest communication. In order, when we start writing procedure, our people have to feel secure in that organization. They have to trust it. Man, when we tried to fix these things, we start throwing them out, and immediately everybody starts defending and justifying and pointing blame, and we're saying, man, let's not worry about that, let's just focus on it. So if you look at, we have to have open and honest communication to where our people feel comfortable, literally setting that deal out on the table where they can talk and communicate and fix those issues and those problems. And I'm assuming that most of y'all have problems or at the other company. So if you look at number 3, move from implied to written procedure, base work center by base work center. So I think you've heard this today, what we're talking about as how we're going to attack this, moving from an informal to a formal organization to working on the 4 barriers. And that's what we're talking about here. We're really having to take that base work center process and step approach to it, because I tried to do it the other way and we couldn't do it. We were trying to do it like all the experts out there telling us how to do it, and it just wasn't happening. And it was interesting, if we're not getting our people involved in the organization and teaching them these base skills, is that it's continually like trying to pull a mule uphill. You're just not going to do it, or you're going to work yourself to death. So we have to get all of our people on the same page, on the same team, going in the same direction. Okay, we're saying move from implied to written procedure, base work center by base work center. That's the key. That's also the key of why we're saying we have to give these base skills to our people. Now, we've been focusing a lot on these 4 barriers and these base skills, but as you're going to see later on in the series, is why these base skills will also give us preventive and proactive attitude, and not only that, but skills to handle these issues. Number 4 is procedures written by the base work centers on how to do the job. This is what we're talking about. Who again, and maybe you can start this chant there wherever you're listening to this thing at, who is the best person to tell you how to do the job? It's the guy doing the job. That's the whole thing behind this. We have to give those tools for that person to do the job. So if you look at this, is that the best person to tell us how to do the job is the person doing the job. We got to break it down by base work center. Process, step, procedure, connecting them, creating the systems. Again, that's why we need the base skills. Okay, system by system breakdown by base work center. Okay, if you look at that, we're talking here, taking the system, as we've said, breaking it down by base work center or by process. Okay, believe it or not, I know you're going, how many more times you're going to say it, this is how we're going to learn, is that once we get through with this, you'll be able to take it with you. Now look at this, taking the system, taking the organization apart by base work center or by process, giving our skills to our people to write process, step, and procedure. We're linking them together by internal customer and supplier. We've agreed on what we need and what we're going to accept, and then we create that system by handing off from our supplier. We get our job, we process it, and we pass it on to our internal customer. So that's what we're talking about there. Again, is system breakdown by base work center. Manage, plan, schedule, and monitor the systems. When you have written procedure, you're now able to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor with written systems. And what you're going to see is that we have to pass these skills down through the organization to where our people can help throughout the organization, because management can't do it alone. They're already overworked, underpaid, overstressed, and all that other stuff. And believe it or not, the folks reporting to them and that they're reporting to are just as frustrated as everybody else. So if you look at this, we're saying that we have to look at the employees gain skills to define their base work center process, steps, and procedures. Okay, in effect, this is what we're talking about, how we're moving from an informal to a formal organization by written procedure. Just focus in on the barrier number 3. Okay, if you look at it, we still can't forget the fear. We still can't forget the lack of communication. Now we're adding into a written procedure. And remember what we had said earlier, by getting people to talk about something they're comfortable with and they know their job, that's how you start opening up communication. But you're not going to get the open and honest communication if there's fear. So again, look at that cycle. Okay, the results. After we go through and start working on these written procedure, now what happens? You know, and you'll also see these guys that'll go, oh, well, we actually had one that wrote this, ask them about their base work center. And they started at home, that they got up in the morning, they did this and they did that, and they thought we were going to get aggravated. And we asked her if we could have her go explain this process and step to other people. Well, she happened to be a 1%, and she kind of lost her thunder. She was trying to be mean to us, and in fact, what it did is that we kind of put it back on her and say, you got great skills on understanding process, step, and procedure. Can you help your fellow team members? Do you think she did? Nope, we just aggravated her. So what's amazing, when we start formalizing these procedures, now what happens is that the accountability starts coming in to hold that 1% accountable. That's where the 20% start jumping on, and that funnel concept. So the written procedure is starting to move to that accountability. And it's not management holding it accountable, it's each employee throughout the organization, because we've agreed on and accepted that accountability. So now I don't have to run to management to get a buy-off or an approval, is that we will hold that accountable. That's how that starts. The results: define base work center process, step, procedure, and system within the organization. It takes us 2 years just to lay out all of this stuff and to get these skills trained, these base skills for continuance and growth in an organization. So if you're looking at it, we're starting to pull the organization, we're starting to give our folks the accountability, we're starting to give our folks the responsibility, they're starting to understand process, step, procedure, they're working on their interpersonal skills and their communication skills. And then we're looking at is that now they're defining the organization. Number 2, we're talking about just by defining it, you improve it. Again, if nothing else from this class, what you'll do is that we want you to remember that. Just by defining it, you improve it, because everybody that's doing that job now is involved in the decision of it, that they've got to come to a consensus agreement. Remember, we talked about that, the things that we have to do to make a consensus agreement. Then in effect, by defining it, you improve it. That's what I was talking about the other day. It gets so frustrating. They talk about this re-engineering stuff, and the organization's not ready to re-engineer because they haven't even engineered to begin with. And all that is just bloodying our people up. Okay, if you look at this, ownership, employee involvement. If you look at, by defining that job, being involved in the process, and now we have the accountability, now we have the responsibility. Now what we have done is that we have ownership and we have involvement by the employee. They now feel a part of the organization. And we're saying by having the written procedure, our system is in a controlled state. Remember what we talked about a controlled state. Out of control state is when it's not defined, the system is on a hit and a miss, and there's no way to collect good data because some days it's way up here, down here, or whatever. So we're saying by writing the procedure, we now come into what we call a controlled state. Remember, we talked about that statistical process and all that other stuff that we'll be going over. When we're in a controlled state, now we can do that. But how do you get to a controlled state? Well, we can't get to a controlled state until we define the systems that in turn start defining the organization. Now we're ready to start doing statistical process control. Okay, let's look at number 5, accountability and holding each other accountable. When you have written procedure, we are now accountable, and now we can hold each other accountable. Remember I was telling you about that 1%? That 1% that has learned how to manipulate the organization? You're able now to hold them accountable. I have figured out now that that person might not be involved because they've never participated with anything the company's done since they've been there. But what happens, the program, we keep moving and going through it. So whether they agree on that base work center or not, somebody's going to make that decision, and so there's going to be that accountability. So what's going to happen is that once this thing gets in place, we're going to be able to hold that 1% accountable. And believe me, this is the toughest stuff your organization will ever do, and it's long term. You could literally do this stuff from here on out, and in most organizations their business is changing, they're growing, their employees are, we're probably, I think we're at about a 15 or 20% rate of getting new employees, so it's a constant deal internally, which means we need written procedure to train and to cross-train. Okay, if you look at number 6, breaking down the barriers and departments, what we're saying there is by having written procedure, opening up the communication, working on the fear, we're now breaking down the barriers between one department, one division, one organization, one base work center member, one team member, or whatever. Number 7, formalizing the way that you're doing business. If you look at that, we're now starting to formalize how we're doing business with written procedure. That's what we were talking about, moving from an informal to a formal organization. So if you look at this, the formal way of doing business when we have written procedure. Number 8 is written by the employee that is doing the job. So if you look at this, the employee that has gained the skills, the base skills now to define their process, their step, and their procedure now, is able to take control over their base work center. And in that, now they continuously improve it. And now we can improve it because it's defined. So remember, that base work center has to be written by that person doing that job in their language and their terminology. Not what comes out of the manual or not what we think that it should be, but what those folks agree on. And believe me, there's nothing more devastating to an employee than they get asked to do or to help or to find or do something like that. And then we come back in and go, hey, yeah, that was kind of going in the right direction, but I need you to do this. Then there goes the trust. Here we're back into that same loop again. So if you look at it, by defining the base work centers, but by defining those process and steps, by defining those procedures, you become self-managed. And we're saying here self-managed promotes leadership at all levels. Why does that happen? Because now we have our processes, our steps, our skills, our interpersonal skills are now working on. Now we're able to become self-managed. And so in effect, all management does, I'm not saying that's all they do, is that now they're able to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor now. They will be able to formalize their base work centers by what we call the reporting-based work centers through the levels in the organization. And we'll get into this in future classes. Okay, so if it looks at all employees can discuss their base work center. This is really what I realized, because there's a lot of companies out there that we have some employees that are illiterate and or can't read or write very good, or they can read a little. And what we're saying here is that if that employee can't speak the language or understand the language, is that what we see is that they develop kind of informal groups in the companies. An example, one of our plants in California had we were 67% Spanish. And if you look at that, what happens was there were some folks that could read and write English. There were some that couldn't. So what happened, they became informal leaders in that organization. Well, the folks that couldn't speak the English didn't feel like they were a part of the company. They're very good workers, always there, always had a nice smile, and the other interesting thing, they knew their job better than anybody else. That's how they overcompensated for not being able to read and write. They were masters at their jobs. And so when we got in and sat down and started talking about their base work centers or their job, man, they knew it inside and out. All of a sudden these grins coming up and they're sitting there talking about the operation. Well, we always have somebody that is writing on the flip chart as we're going down, as they're defining their base work center. So now what happens, what we have been told, is that now that employee feels like they're a part of that organization. And they're a part of that organization because they feel like they are contributing. Because there's one thing that they can talk about. They can talk about their job. That's the same way as that some of the folks that go to happy hour. What are we all talking about at happy hour on Friday afternoon? Our job. And it's usually not the things that, hey, I'm just making way too much money. They're giving me way too many raises. In fact, I'm going to leave that company because they're patting me on the back too much. They appreciate me too much. That ain't what's happening. Okay, so if you look at, we're going to kind of finish up. That's what we're talking about, the lack of written procedure, what it looks like. Also, too, how do we address it? And then what is the results? Now I'm hoping you'll be able to understand why these base skills. Is it any more important for the CEO, president of organization to know how to define their job, their base work centers, their department heads, their vice presidents, or the management? are the frontline guys. It's just as important as anybody. The same people on the same page going in the same direction, because that's one of the toughest things. That's where we've created a base training program for the entire organization, which doesn't exist. So if you look at it with this base work center concept and these base skills and this applied business science, we're now able to bring curriculum to everybody in the organization, and that does not exist right now. So if you look at, let's look at page number 6. Page number 6, we're looking at managing a procedure. We talked earlier about, we call them those dust collecting manuals and stuff, and we're going, okay, if we do have written procedure, it's usually in a book somewhere, and nobody knows where to find it, or we don't even look at it, and there's a bunch of dust sitting on top of it. And that was actually a true story, that there was about that much dust on this thing in a water treatment plant. Okay, let's look at this. It says, managing a procedure. Where does our implied procedure go once it turns into a written procedure? Remember, an implied procedure is one that's not written down, and we're saying that that thing's implied. Okay, what we're saying is the written procedure, the written base work center procedure goes into the base work center that it affects. Could be one or more. Let's look at it as an example of a work order or a purchase order. Usually there's a lot of people internally within the organization that touch that. So what happens is that we give them to that written procedure, and it applies and goes into their base work center packet. Because remember, who is the best person to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor that procedure? That's how we were able to keep the thing updated. Instead of putting it in a manual out here that really no one was able to access, but everybody has a copy of the procedure. The other place that it goes is that sometimes the solution procedure might go into the organization policy manual, plant operation policy, or store operating policy, etc. So it could really go into how we're going to be running business, from shutting down to locking up to doing all this different stuff. And if you look at that, we collect those also in what we call information centers. We call them ICs. Information center, we try to group those base work centers that are alike, or what we call internal customer and supplier. Example, usually in accounting there's an information center. So all the base work centers in those particular departments are in that information center. Like the plant, example, they'll all be right there. The drivers, they'll be in one information center. So what we do is try to keep a master file of all the base work centers and all the written procedures in those areas where we can use them. Because what happens, that now becomes a great tool for training and referencing. And also we had one person, we actually had a person that had to leave work on a family deal, and all of a sudden they were the ones that were processing payroll. You would be you wouldn't be surprised on the response you get when the checks aren't ready, or we're about ready to figure out that we don't have the person here to cut the checks. So what happened, Margie actually took the written base work center process and steps, and she was our human resource director. She took that and followed through the process and actually got payroll out. And what was interesting, when Alice came back, Margie goes, "There's a mistake in your procedure." And she goes, "You're kidding." And so they went back over it. So by having that process, step, and procedure, she took that base work center, opened it up, and went through the computer system and printed. That's what we're talking about. That's where we were talking about that training and cross-training stuff. So if you look at managing a procedure, we want to look at where does the procedure go. Goes in every base work center, and in those information centers, or in those policy or store operating policies. Let's look at number 7, page number 7. We're going to move on now to system story. If you look at this, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go over the bullet points with us. I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. They're going to be listed, and I'm wanting you to think about these, and I'm going to go back and we're going to describe this story. We try to look at and define a system. By this we mean the way we do things internally within the organization. We were confronted early on and how to improve the systems and how we could break them down. We took a straightforward look and developed base work center process and steps. Okay, then we said all employees must be involved in defining the systems of their base work center. A system defines the way we do everything within that organization. The more fear there is, the tougher it is to define. Okay, now this is what we're talking about, the systems. Now you see why it's so important of what we're talking about, the systems. There's stuff out there you call process mapping or whatever you want to call it, flow charting or whatever, but we call it process steps and procedures of that particular base work center. Remember, so what happens here is that the system, in effect, throughout the organization is broken down by base work centers, and we get everybody in the organization focusing in and looking at their base work center. And in that, they define their process, step, and procedure. When we're saying that there's the more fear in an organization, the harder it is to define, well, you can just imagine that. If I'm fearful to even start talking about my job, because if we start talking about our job or things that are going wrong, we have a tendency to say, I'm not doing my job, or I'm doing it wrong. And we're saying it's the 4 barriers. If you got to blame somebody or do something, focus in on those. It's not our people. Remember, 99% of the time, it's not our people. Our people are doing the right thing. We have to give them the skills to do that. So if you look at the systems here, the systems are talking about how we define the organizations, the way we do things internally. So I'm going to go back and let's look at the base work center. It says, the life lesson, it says, no system is too complex when the people doing the actual job take it apart process by process, step by step, procedure by procedure. So if you look at this, by defining the system, you can improve it. And see, this is what we're talking about. It's that simple. Pull the organization apart by base work centers, that we start separating the processes, we start defining the process, step, and procedures, pulling them together, we've defined the organizational structure, we move from informal to a formal organization. And let's look at page number 8. Page number 8 is justify and defend. Again, I'll kind of hit the bullet points and we'll go back and talk about it. Don't try to pin the blame. The objective is to resolve the issue, not find a scapegoat. Rational reason to justify and defend it. Our intent is to solve the issue, not to pin the blame, and the funnel concept. Okay, again, what we're talking here is that when we start looking at these problems and these issues or these systems or these processes or addressing problems, we have a tendency to do what we call justify and defend. Because usually how we do it, we have to blame somebody. So I don't care, I've been through enough of this negotiation stuff that if you sit there and try to beat that person into submission, whether it's right or it's wrong, they're going to defend and justify. So what we're saying is, let's not spend time, energy, or effort in trying to figure out who's to blame. Let's take that energy and put it into a positive manner in order to define our systems. And we're talking about the intent. The intent is to solve the problem, not to beat our people up. 2 rules, all that other stuff coming in. The funnel concept. Remember the funnel concept, and this is important. The 1% bad employee, and we all know who the 1% is. The 1% affects 5% with the same negative characteristics that in turn affect 20% of the organization with maybe one of those negative characteristics that in turn affect 20%. So if you look at, we're saying over a 24-month period, because of the accountability mainly through the hard data moving from emotion to data, the funnel concept, the 1% drops out. The other folks jump on. So what happens? The 1% funnels out. Now, in our first few years, the easiest thing to do is start beating our people up, and we're saying, let's not beat our people up. Again, let's look at and believe statistically that 99% are good people and do the right thing. So if you look at this, we want to say that we don't defend or justify. All we want to do is fix the issue or the problem. So if you look at that, the life lesson is, is that when you're addressing employee conflict, remove your and the company's emotions from the deal and deal only with facts and data. So what we're saying is just take your emotion out of it, deal only with the facts and the data. And that's really hard, and that in itself is a huge discipline. But if you don't, you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, let's look now at page number 9, the corporate model. Okay, if you look at this corporate model, now this particular story has a lot of stuff in it. If you look at a corporate model, a good quality program faces its first major decision when it encounters the organization with multiple sites. Okay, that's a key point, and we're going to come back to that. And that's what's lining up with what we call this corporate model. Okay, how the program will interact with the organization, we have to install the program with a model or without a model. So here we're looking at, in a multiple site, we're looking at how in the world are we going to install install the program, and without a model. Because what you're going to see is that most companies want instant gratification and they want it overnight. Then let's look down. It says trying to go back and manage and monitor what is happening with one particular location is utter chaos. We spend 99% of the time readdressing and correcting that particular training program or whatever it is we're trying to implement in the organization. It may take a year to develop the corporate model. Now see, there's a lot of folks saying, Bruce, they want it right now. Remember, you have been going over these last 40 years with these instant result things that'll tell you they'll save the world in 1 month or 1 quarter. Let's look back, it ain't happening. So just think if you'd have got started when you first started with some of this other stuff, looking at the 4 barriers in these processes and steps, where we would have been right now. And it says, sometimes we can manage and monitor. It says, now when we sit down with the different divisions, we have something that we can manage and monitor. No matter how big or small, change creates fear and insecurity because of the 4 barriers. The corporate model, the corporate must support the model, and that sets the tone for change. If change is too fast, then it creates chaos and fear. Okay, let's look at this corporate model. I have been on planes where I've seen trainers flying from one organization to the next, or one department, one division, and all they're doing, basically, bless their hearts, 4 days a week is on planes going from one thing. They don't even have time to take a breath. And what we're saying here is that let's look at, when we're trying to move something organization-wide, we have to build a model, because I've been involved in too many of these deals secondhand, coming in trying to fix these things, that we had this great concept, great plan, or great new product, and we immediately tried overnight put it throughout the organization. What you'll see is that the majority of the stuff, including your new software package, if you've done a conversion on your software with handling your accounting and all that, I've been through now 3 of those things over the last 11 years, and every one of those guys that come in say that, hey, this thing will solve all your problems, all that. Well, we've learned to run dual systems in that switch over. And what happens is that by trying to do it overnight across the organization has now just created, let's say we got 10 sites, a problem in 10 different sites now. So what we're saying is, by creating the model, if there's an issue or something going wrong in this thing, we're right there, got the corporate model, and we're only having to fix it one time. And what we've discovered is, by developing that corporate model, and when we go to other divisions or departments or whatever throughout the organization, it makes an easier transition. It's easier for people to take a tangible and work with it than an intangible. And an intangible is an informal organization starting to put the structure in there. So when we're saying that the corporate model, if we have it laid out and a plan that we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor, if there is an issue, we'll know up here in the front. We can correct it and fix it, then we can put it out to the organization. And it's going to go a lot faster than the original. So it's very important before we start doing across-the-board organizational change, and I don't care what it is, we have to take that time and create the corporate model. Because if we're doing it any other way, it's going to create change and fear. And guess what? How many things do you think that our employees or departments have gotten that in effect that blew up or didn't work right? And so they're going, oh man, here it comes again. Here's another thing that's going to blow up, another thing that they didn't get us involved in, another thing that's going to cause me a headache, another thing that's going to cause me working 60 hours a week. You know, when are those guys going to learn? And if you look at the life lesson says to try to create a multiple location quality program is unrealistic without the development of a corporate model. You're just beating your head against a wall. And that also ties in with anything else you're trying to do in the company. You have to develop that corporate model, because if you don't, it's really hard when you got it spread out throughout the organization to fix all those things. And we're losing credibility, and plus the frustration level goes up. Remember, we talked about the consistency that promotes truth, that promotes trust, and all that. That's a part of it. Let's look at qualify and monitor. That's story on page number 10. If you look at this, the qualify and monitor, I'll again kind of hit the bullet points with you. What we're saying here, what do we mean to qualify and monitor? We mean to qualify and monitor data is also to qualify any questions asked. If it isn't because they don't want to be held accountable, it is because they are used to spending their days dealing with all kinds of fires and chaos within the organization. Flexibility has become their safety net over the years. Unscheduled, unplanned, unscheduled, scheduled. If the employees in the employee's defense, they have never had any real base management training on such things as scheduling, reporting, and planning. And if you look at communication and qualifying information with everyone involved in the process. When we monitor it, we hold one another accountable. If we have a system or a procedure, it needs to be documented in written form. When we tried to find the ownership of it, we found that no one ever even needed the form. It was hard to qualify and monitor when the organization is informal and there is fear. Okay, what we're talking about here in this qualify and monitor, remember we just talked about earlier justify and defend. Okay, then we talked about if you get in there and we start doing these things, and when there's the 4 barriers, people are literally going to start defending and justifying what in the world's going on. So if you look at it, what we talked about, defending and justifying, got to look at moving that fear and doing all that, and then look at the issue, not pin blame, so we don't have to spend time defending or justifying. Let's look at building the corporate model, and now we're looking at qualifying and monitoring. And what we're talking about here is that when we get something, like an order called in, we had one company that had an order come in for a new truck or something. They said, yeah, we need a new part for a truck. Okay, well, what kind of truck? There's about a gazillion of them. Well, we should have qualified it. And if you look at it, if we qualify and monitor that deal throughout the process, that's how we can almost guarantee the success. But we can't do that until we have written procedure. And we can't do that until we have that written procedure developed by the people doing that are connecting the systems and working on the 4 barriers to quality. So the qualify and monitor, when people are coming to you with stuff, you need to qualify and monitor what y'all agree on. Now this is what we're talking about. If it's not in written form, chances are that thing ain't going to make it. So what you're doing is just putting yourself into a bad position. So again, we're saying we have to qualify and monitor everything internally within the organization that we're doing. Learn to ask those questions. And what are we going to qualify and monitor? It's going to be really tough to monitor something that's not defined. So if you look at the life lesson down at the bottom, it says to make decisions based on data, we must qualify the data, manage and monitor the data. If we are not managing and monitoring the data collected, then we do not need to collect it. Now, isn't that kind of an interesting concept? I don't know about y'all, but we probably get 10 or 20 reports a day, and we're trying to figure out, okay, we got the report, nobody ever follows up on it, so I'm sitting here doing this. We're saying, why even do it? If you're not monitoring the data, why collect it? So we need to be able to qualify and monitor those things that are interacting with us daily in that organization. So let's now look at page number 12, which are our frequently asked questions and our thoughts. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing here when we're looking at, the first question is, why are systems the responsibility of management? Okay. That's a long one, and that's a complex one. If you look at it, internally within the organization is that the employees are powerless to put a system into place, and it's the responsibility of management. And the more in-depth that those problems or those issues are, the more responsibility it is of management to lead and make it happen. Because that's where we're saying is that I'm kind of looking at the educational and training industry that has not given our industries what they've been asking for, the how-to. If you look at this, we have to now give our managers a system that we can go in, that we can manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. And we're saying that the only way that it's going to happen is with the support of management, okay? And the management has to take the lead. Remember, our people are powerless. There's absolutely nothing we can do. And I've already told you about that one thing is that, again, we all went to a seminar that says, don't bring me a problem, bring me a solution. You know, that's almost to a point where it gets insulting. Because when there's the 4 barriers and none of that stuff in place, what am I going to bring you? So, yeah, that's easy. Well, I told you to bring a solution. That's what we were talking about the other day with the 2 sharp sticks. Which one you want me to poke in my eye? No matter which one I do, I still get a sharp stick in the eye, and then you come back to me and go, hey, you're the one that made the decision. I told you. Yeah, like what could I do? If you look at what is a base work center, now we're talking about a base work center, and that's why we're really focusing in on this to see not only the need for the base skills, but also too of why those base skills have to be in place and why moving from an informal to a formal organization, those base work centers, those base skills have to be throughout the organization. Now remember, the base work center, the base, the foundation of your work, the center of your work. So what we tried to do was to pull together all these things and spread apart all the systems and break them up by processes that we really turned around and looked and called them base work centers. So if you look at that, a base work center is your area of expertise and control. It's your process and step and procedure of how you do your job. Your main responsibility or your base work center. Because remember the platinum rule, we also have additional duties. A base work center never suffers at the expense of an additional duty. Okay, so now what we're saying with the additional duties. What are the additional duties of a base work center, and are they a part of a base work center? Yes, they are. An additional duty is daily, weekly, monthly, and as needed. So if you look at a base work center, I'm focusing on my job, my area of expertise and control. Everything else is additional duties. Now, also remember that we're saying a lot of the additional duties are somebody else's base work center. Remember, come back into it. Who is the best person to tell us how to do the job? The person doing the job, the person defining the job. Say, and I kind of covered 2 of them. And it says, what is the base work center platinum rule? Remember that one, is that the base work center never suffers at the expense of an additional duty. That's the platinum rule. Do office management-based work centers have process and steps? Okay. Now this is kind of a tough one, and this is why management-based work centers and office-based work centers are so difficult. If you look at this, all the different things in management that we do, and we're saying the majority of the management out there, we don't have or have not given them systems to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor. Remember, we're saying a base work center, your process and step and procedure is literally taking what you do, you process it with a procedure, and you pass it on. And that does not suffer at an additional duty. The problem with, let's say, management now is that management is responsible for several different things. Maybe it's day-in report of our people. Maybe it could be absenteeism and tardiness. How many widgets that we processed, how many phone calls we did, or what was our revenue, how many units or time, whatever. What we're saying is under the management-based work center is that their base work center looks like what we call work centers under a base work center, meaning they're major deals, like accounts payable. And we're saying that is accounts payable any less than accounts receivable? No, but I still am responsible for both of them. What you see is that by managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring, we set up these work centers of when we're going to work and do them. So the golden or the platinum rule applies here, is that, remember, the base work center is come heck or high water, you do, and it is not at the expense of your additional duties. So management will have several major what we call work centers under them, and they could be accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory, weekend, month end, quarterly reports, or whatever. We're saying that they're responsible for that. And we're saying that no one, and that's why it's really tough to line up the base work center, because once we've agreed on it, we're now held accountable. What this does is get us to start planning those systems in there, and then it gets us to start scheduling them, that in turn start setting up the managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring. Because remember, in management, what are we really there to do? We're there to support our people, and in that we have to look at how we support the processing or supporting of our order request of our product and service. So if you look at where a non-management worker is that example, I'm going to say that I receive raw material, I go through my process and I do it, and then I turn it out. Whereas management will literally have a bunch of work centers that are complex, but they're held accountable for them. So then we take each one of those work centers and then define a process and step. And we ask them to define the one that's most crucial to their job. So we all get them to start on one. So if you look at it, a base work center for non-management usually consists on I receive something, I process it, then I pass it on. A manager's base work center is really looking at, built around the system of managing, planning, scheduling, and monitoring the organization. And for office workers or support people, it could literally be accounts payable, receivable, as well as what the management could be responsible for. So they could have several different work centers under that. Then under that, they would have the process, step, and procedure. So that's the tough thing, is pulling apart, because if you're in management, step back and really look at it. Number one, again, we've most all have evolved up through the organization, and most time there was not a system there to help us. So that's what we've got to do, is create those systems now. Okay, so that's what do office management base work centers have process and steps? Yes, they do, but it's a little more complex, and that's another thing that will help us start sorting through all these things we do daily and how we do them. Okay, and it says hold on to, not delegate work. Okay, what we're saying here is hold on to and not delegate work. When we're looking at holding on, especially when we first get started, because of the fear and because of the way that we've been doing business, we have literally hold on. And in sometimes up through the process, knowledge is power. And sometimes we have some negative influence in the organization. And so what happens is that we have a tendency to hold on. Holding on basically means that I have control. So, and when there's fear in an organization, we have a tendency, it's almost like we're having to pry stuff down to get that information out. And it can be either on a positive or a negative. And most of the time it's because of the fear, because no one else knows how to do my job. If I keep it, then I control it, so now I've got power. And then also, too, the 1% use this to manipulate our co-workers. Okay, number 7, by defining you improve the systems. I think we've said that a gazillion times already. If you really want to do some strategic planning and where are we going to go, I would say you guys get started on defining your processes and your systems, because wherever you want to go different from where you're currently at, the only way you're going to get there and sustain it, or for that continuance and growth, is to work and focus on building your organizational structure, moving from informal to formal. Because in effect, what we're doing is building that vehicle for continuance and for growth. So if we're looking at, by defining it, you improve it. You're going to hear it again throughout this whole thing, because that's really what it is. Procedure is the most important barrier. Yes and no. We're saying if we have written procedure, then we can kind of agree on all this stuff that's happening and we can hold it accountable. Let's say we've got written procedure, and there's a gazillion companies out right now that have written procedure, or they're certified, or they've gone through certification. And how many times have we seen they have the written procedure, but if there's fear in the organization, how good is the written procedure? It's not. So if you look at it, all these barriers are basically very important and they're interrelated. That's why we're saying fear is the number one. Fear is the number one, because really, even if I didn't have or have written procedure, if there was an issue, I could run over there and try to put the fire out and try to accomplish something. That's why fear is number one. And it looks at here, it says, why is procedure important to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor? Again, if it's not defined, if it's informal, and it's not written by the people that are doing the job, how in the world are we going to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor it? What we're saying is we need to get those skills to each base work center at any level, up or down the organizational structure, to where they can individually manage, plan, schedule, and monitor their base work center. And it says, what is the best way to manage a procedure? The best way to manage the procedure is give it to the person that's doing the job, let them hold it, and let them continually update it, because also on our procedures we have the other base work centers that are a part of or have some input into that procedure. So what we're saying is we give them what we call their team member handbook that has their base work center in it, that they work on defining their process, step, and procedures. So that's the best way to manage it, as well as putting it into these information centers or the store operating policy. So that's where we're saying is that how we can keep them updated. Explain the corporate model. The corporate model is very important. I don't care in regards to the 4 barriers or whatever you're talking about, but in developing the corporate model, you want to look at developing what you're going to do, whether it's a new product or new service or the processing or supporting of it, moving it through the organization. Let's create the model and then move it through the organization. The other thing is that how does fear impede defining systems? When you get in there and if there's fear, everyone's going to be scared to death to even talk about improving the system, because when there's fear, all of a sudden we're sitting here, if we're saying the system's wrong, that means that we're doing something wrong. We're ending up now today's class, and we want you to really think about this, about the 4 barriers, and we want to think about the classes that we've gone. Think about today, and you can think about, and we really want you to see the relationship. And our next class is going to be breaking through the lack of training. So think about everything we did, and thanks a lot, and we'll see you at the next class.